And so on this snowy Valentine's weekend evening, Uncle John's just got a couple of stories for you. So just get comfortable. Too bad I can't give you all a mug of hot chocolate. But a young man excitedly told his spiritual director about a dream he had had the night before. I dreamt I fell into a deep pit, helpless and despairing. I couldn't get out. A Confucius approached and said, "Let me give you some advice, my friend. If you get out of trouble, never get in it again." A Buddhist came and said, "If you can climb up to where I can reach you, I will help." A Christian Scientist came along and said, "You only think you're in a pit." A self-righteous person said, "Only bad people fall into pits." A fundamentalist said, "You must deserve your pit." An IRS agent asked, "Are you paying taxes on this pit?" An optimist came along and said, "Things could be worse." A pessimist came along and said, "Things will get worse." Then along came Jesus, who, seeing my situation, jumped into the pit with me. He had me climb on his shoulders and helped me out of the pit. The young man discovered compassion was the greatness of being a Christian, to jump into the pit of life rather than standing on the sidelines as a spectator or an overseer. And those of us who call ourselves Christians, is there compassion like Jesus in our lives? We're getting ready to move into the season of Lent. At the end of the season of Lent, we remember and we focus on Christ's passion, his suffering. But before his passion came his compassion. Before his suffering, as we heard in the gospel, he was willing to be with those who were suffering. And I think going into Lent, it might be a good time for us to do a compassion check. Look at the crucifix, and we've looked at crucifixes for decades, whatever. We just kind of, okay, yeah. Or we reverence it, we kiss it, and we say there's no greater love than this, and so on and so forth. And yet, we forget what a horrible, awful, barbaric instrument of torture that was. I don't know if you've ever been in any of the Spanish missions down in California, but the Spanish, they seem to go out of their way to make their crucifixes as bloody or as gory as they could. Jesus had scraped bloody knees, and it just... And, that's not the kind of stuff that is supposed to shock us into feeling bad. Look at what your sins are doing to Jesus. No, that's ridiculous. That snuff film that Mel Gibson put out many years ago, The Passion of the Christ. There were so many who said, "Oh, That just really reminded me of how much Jesus suffered for us. Well, so what? What's the effect on us? We can see that suffering, but we've let ourselves get comfortable with it. What about the other sufferings that are going on among God's people in this world? Where is our compassion? Are we willing to pray in whatever way, let our hearts go out to them and suffer with them? Or do we just turn away? I don't want to see that. Years ago, Mary Brenner was a 48-year-old divorced mother of 7 children. She worked in Beverly Hills and owned a carbon paper manufacturing company. She dealt with all the movie stars. She went to their parties. She hobnobbed with the celebrities, the kind of people whose faces leer at us out of People magazine. What turned her around and made her see life differently? She came across a very famous photograph that many of us may have seen many times. The photo was taken during the Holocaust, and it's a picture of people lined up. A little 8 or 9-year-old boy is standing with his hands up, and a Nazi is pointing a rifle at the kid, whose little eyes show deep fear and bewilderment. Mary Brenner looked at that photo and suddenly realized that life could never be the same for her. She felt an enormous compassion for all those who were victims of other people's brutality and for those who were the most marginalized. So she went to the Bishop of San Diego and said, "I'd like to have some kind of a little religious order here, and I'd like to dedicate myself to those people nobody wants. Who are the most deprived?" She wound up being called Sister Antonio, and she works with the women in the Tijuana prison, a women's prison in Mexico. These women are certainly among the most abject, forlorn, and neglected segment of society. She's their friend, companion, sister, mother, and grandmother, all wrapped in one. She saw a picture of tremendous suffering decades earlier, and her heart was moved, and her life was changed. Do we remember the compassion of Christ? Or do we just turn away? On 2 days during the year, a certain doctor goes upstairs to his closet and takes out of it a coat that is out of style. One sleeve is patched, and it's rather tawdry and stringy and dirty. He showed it to me one day, and I asked him why he wore it on certain days of the year. And he told me that once when he was an intern in New York City, in Lower Manhattan, he got a call one very blustery, cold, wintry night. A little girl came banging at his door. He threw on his jacket and went over to a stinking tenement, up very dirty stairs into a one-room apartment where a little boy lay horribly sick. His mother and father were hovering over him. He did what he could for the malnourished child, but in spite of his best efforts, the little boy died then and there in front of them. The doctor was shivering not only from the hurt of the boy dying, but because there was no heat in the tenement. The boy's father took off his coat, this very coat, and gave it to him and said, "Here, you're cold. Thank you for trying to save our boy." The doctor knew that this was the only way the couple could possibly thank him. He didn't have the heart to refuse or give it back. Now that he's prominent and fairly wealthy, once or twice a year, on the anniversary of that boy's death and the day he got his diploma to be a doctor, he wears that coat to remind himself of what it's all about. Here we are, once a year for several weeks, going into this season of Lent, where we are called by our prayer, by our fasting, by our works of charity, to grow in the compassion of Christ, to be more willing to care, to learn the lesson of Christ jumped into the pit. Will we let that happen this year? Or will we just once again say, okay, what do I have to give up? Wow, look how heroic I'm being. Me, me, me. This year, for Lent, maybe we can just learn to resist the urge to turn away when it's easier to just not see it, to just not care. We can't, take all the suffering in the world on our shoulders. No. But how about remembering to care a little bit more? Nothing is ever going to change if we don't. Pink Floyd had a song, and I'm not going to sing it to you, I promise. But it's called "On the Turning Away." And it's just that idea, how easy it can be for us to ignore the realities, say, it's not our problem. Say, they deserve it. The last verse goes, "No more turning away from the weak and the weary. No more turning away from the coldness inside. Just a world that we all must share. It's not enough just to stand and stare. Is it only a dream that there'll be no more turning away?" Compassionate Lord, help us to be more like you.